Benito, an arch-conservative, has stated that he had no involvement in flying the flag and blamed his wife.
3 Spanish tourists and an Afghan citizen have been killed in a gun attack in the city of Bamyan in central Afghanistan. Several other people were wounded when 2 gunmen opened fire on a vehicle in the city's central market. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said he was shocked by the news. The Taliban spokesman said 4 people had been arrested. The presidents of Mexico and Guatemala have announced that they will boost security and improve the infrastructure at 4 of their main border crossings. The 2 leaders met in the Mexican border city of Tapachula. Mexico and Guatemala have been under huge pressure from the United States to do more to stop illegal migrants from Central and South America. The Mexican president says the situation will only improve if Washington helps reduce poverty and corruption in the region. The most widely followed stock market index in the United States, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, has closed above 40,000 for the first time. The continued rise on Friday was propelled by easing inflation figures and strong economic growth. BBC News.
From the BBC World Service, this is the Outlook Next Week, where we'll be playing the hits and sharing the best of the week's extraordinary personal stories. I'm Aussie Brooks, and these are my colleagues.
Hello, I'm Jo Fidgen. Welcome to Outlook. Hello, it's Emily Rudd here, and this is Outlook, bringing you extraordinary first-person stories from around the world.
Coming up today on the mixtape, Side 1, people uncovering and documenting the mysteries of the past. And we start in Argentina in my interview with a formidable woman named Moira Millan. Moira grew up in the city of Bahia Blanca in the province of Buenos Aires when the country was under a military dictatorship. Moira told me that at school she was taught that Argentina was a white nation and that the indigenous Mapuche people had died out long ago. In 1986, when she was 16, Moira traveled to Brazil to become an evangelical missionary. And it was there that Moira had an encounter that challenged the very core of who she thought she was.
Cuando estoy en Brasil, un anciano,
when I was in Brazil, an old man from Mato Grosso, who was an activist in the landless movement, greeted me and said, "Tú eres indígena, you are indigenous." And I was offended.
Like as if it was an insult.
en Argentina, ser indígena era un insulto, porque ser indígena encarnaba la barbarie.
Well, in Argentina, to be indigenous was an insult, because to be indigenous embodied ugliness and ignorance, the savage, everything bad, everything that had to be overcome. My mother loved me, and I have no doubt about that. But when she talked to my relatives, she would tell them that
Moira no consigue buenos trabajos porque solo toman a las lindas.
Moira doesn't get good jobs because they only take the pretty ones. In other words, she assumed that I was ugly because I was indigenous.
Esa afirmación de mi madre, yo la escuché escuchar.
And I heard my mother talking like this since I was very young. She told us that we had to study because we weren't attractive and we were poor. All of this was related with being Mapuche. So having an indigenous identity really carries a negative weight.
But Moira couldn't shake what the man from Mato Grosso had told her. Deep down, she was starting to feel the truth of it. It would explain a lot of her childhood memories, the bullying at school for being different. And so, at first reluctantly, she began to accept she might actually be indigenous. She left the missionary training school in Brazil and returned to Argentina in a state of shock, with no idea what to do next. She didn't quite know who she was anymore, or where she belonged.
Cuando regreso a Argentina, renunciando a mi trabajo como misionera y a la iglesia, recuerdo muy deprimida.
When I returned to Argentina, I left the church and my work as a missionary. I was very depressed. I was drinking a lot to try to escape my pain and sadness, parties and all of that. I was only 18 years old, but I was very, very sad, very depressed. My mother didn't know what to do. I had 2 suicide attempts.
Moira was totally lost. She no longer had her Christian faith to comfort she hadn't come to terms with her indigenous identity either. She wasn't one thing or another. She knew something in her life had to give, or she'd be lost for good.
Hasta que decido ir a mi territorio.
But I decided to visit the area where my family comes from. I asked my mother for permission to go to the countryside to see my family there. And I arrived right in the middle of the preparations for a beautiful ceremony that changed my life.
Hermosa ceremonia que cambió mi vida. When you first arrived to Patagonia, to Chubut, where your aunts and your uncles and your family lives, what are your first impressions of the land, the place?
De sanación. Yo sentí que el viento me acariciaba. Of healing. I felt the wind caressed me and the earth embraced me. It's an arid land. There is an immense steppe, a paramo, like a desert, and, well, it's not really the kind of landscape or beauty that we're used to seeing on postcards.
Still, you felt like it was embracing you.
Sí, porque ahí entendí que es la gente. Because there I understood that what it means to be people of the land. Because Mapuche are people of the land. I understood that everything in this region was inhabited by spiritual forces. Everything was full of life.
Todo tenía vida. When you got there to stay with your family and you were discovering about your identity really for the first time, one of the things that happened was this traditional ceremony. Could you tell me about it?
La ceremonia es de 4 días en medio del desierto.
The ceremony lasted 4 days in the middle of the desert. We don't build temples or anything like that. It's simply nature and us in community. A sacred fire is lit that cannot be extinguished for those 4 days. We sing and dance around the fire. We share, stories are told, dreams told, and offerings are made to the forces of nature. Those days, I couldn't stop crying as I looked at the sky, the stars, the fire, the wind, and that wrinkled hand pressing me. I thought, this is who I am. This is what they have taken from me. I have found it again.
Lo he vuelto a encontrar. Is that where you were flying in this morning? Yes.
Actualmente, siempre
Nowadays, when I come across people who are starting to discover their roots and to walk in the memory of their people, they always cry, they hug me and cry, and I understand. I understand those tears.
It sounds like there was this feeling of loss, but also maybe joy. What else were you feeling in those 4 days?
las lágrimas no eran solo físicas.
Yes, yes, definitely. Those tears were not only of sadness, but also of joy, because sometimes we cry out of joy to gratitude.
And what about your parents? How were they reacting to you rediscovering your Mapuche identity? You were now a their faith, the evangelical Christian faith. How are they reacting now?
Durante un tiempo fue muy duro para ellos.
For a while, my Mapuche activism was very hard for me, because as soon as I assumed my Mapuche identity, my twin brother assumed it too, and my older sister, finally the whole family.
We were moved further south, Chilscow, a town in the same Patagonian province of Chubut. In the early 1990s, she settled down and started a family, raising her kids on ancestral Mapuche land and becoming a leader. This meant leading the fight against gold mining companies and sometimes taking on the Argentine government. In the different indigenous groups of Argentina.
Ever since I was very little, I suffered abuse. So I went out to walk across indigenous territories to find out whether I was alone in suffering these things. But I discovered that it was repeated in all of our lives. I began to sense that the only way to heal was to be able to look at ourselves with dignity and love and recognize ourselves as beautiful and intelligent, to see ourselves as powerful. And the only way to do this was to unite.
Porque Argentina es un país que nos desprecia. Y ese desprecio lo vemos.
Because Argentina is a country that despises us. And we see that contempt not only within the institutions and in the eyes of Argentinians, but we even see it in the eyes of our own men. The truth is that meeting all these indigenous sisters from different nations changed my life.
Y la verdad es que cambió mi vida encontrarme con hermanas indígenas de diferentes naciones.
Argentina is over 2,000 miles north to south. The Andes run the length of the country. There are also deserts and forests. And many of the 35 indigenous groups recognized by the government live in some of the most remote and hard-to-reach corners of the country. Moira was determined to meet them, but she didn't have a car, and public transport didn't reach many of the villages. This was going to be a monumental journey. It would take her almost 3 years. How did you do it?
Es para una novela y para una película. Porque salí a caminar.
The stories for a novel or a movie. I went by foot, literally. So sometimes I walked 20 kilometers, sometimes more. Sometimes I hitchhiked. I remember being on Tierra del Fuego, near Ushuaia, on the road in the middle of winter, and the sun was going down. And I thought, I'm going to die.
Y pensé, voy a morir.
Winter nights in Tierra del Fuego can drop below -4°C, and Moira was alone.
Finalmente paró un camionero.
Finally, a truck driver stopped and gave me a ride. I started to tell every truck driver who picked me up the purpose of my walk, and they organized a big network all over the country to support me. In the world of truckers, I became famous. I was the mapuche who went around gathering the women.
La mapuche que andaba visitando a las mujeres. ¿A dónde te llevó? A 15,000.
15,000.
Indigenous people in Argentina face widespread discrimination and inequality, and yet their stories, their struggles, rarely make the national headlines. So when 15,000 indigenous women showed up in the Argentine capital, this was massive. They were essentially saying they would no longer be ignored.
What were the demands? What were you asking for? No íbamos a pedir, sino que íbamos a proponer.
We weren't going to ask, but propose. And we proposed a new law for el buen vivir, the right to good living, which is something the whole world needs, which asks how do we establish a political, economic, environmental, and cultural order that is just and fair.
After nearly 3 years, this across the country, gathering all the women together one by one, sharing their grievances, and providing dreams, the day had finally arrived.
And I was very happy to have gone to lead the march, to enter the Congress with all my sisters. And we spoke for the first time in that Congress about our dreams and our rights as indigenous women.
Nosotras, de 36 naciones, venimos acá para decirle que el acuerdo y el consenso fueron perdidos. Les invitamos a su voto. ¡Paren de vuelo!
Y bueno, nunca se trató de ley, pero
The law was never really put forward, but we continue to think about and work towards good living as a right.
I know you say that the proposal was not taken very seriously by the government, but do you think, what kind of impact do you think the march had in Argentina and for these indigenous women and for you?
nos volvimos visibles
Yes, we became visible to a society that had invisibilized us, and that was important progress.
Para nuestras ancestral
joy and strength of seeing us all together there. It swept away the pain of my body, the pain of heartbreak, and installed joy. I realized that winning a collective fight is the greatest orgasm you could ever have.
Al que se gana una lucha colectiva es el orgasmo más grande que se pasa.
The Unstoppable Moira Mia. Now we're crossing the South Atlantic Ocean to the remote island of St. Louis to meet our next guest. Anina Flamil was working on a construction project for the island's first airport when human remains were uncovered. The discovery would alter not only her understanding of the island's unique history, but of her own heritage too. It all started with an email from a friend about a job offer. Anina told my colleague Emily Webb why she applied, even though she'd never even heard of St. Helena before.
They were quite urgently looking for someone. Within the space of me actually getting the job, I had to pack my bags and I had 2 weeks to say goodbye to family and friends, and then I just had one suitcase. And as a 24-year-old young woman with no other responsibilities, I could start my new adventure, and I got on this ship and knew absolutely no one, and left behind everything I had known up until that point.
How are you feeling about it?
Terrified. I was terrified, but I think it was probably the perfect place to go to Saint Helena, and the RMS was a little portion of Saint Helena on this ship where you had fully saints, as what they're called, people from Saint Helena crew that were working aboard the ship, and it was I think 120 other passengers at most. Most of which were the construction crew, and it was just an amazing experience and introduction to life on St. Helena. I mean, they were so excited about this airport that we could go.
How long did the journey take? And also how often did the boat travel between South Africa and St. Helena?
So at the time, the RMS would sail every 3 weeks, I think it was. It's 12 years ago now. But it would take 6 days by sea to get from Cape Town to St. Helena. So that's 6 days of fun and activities, ranging from skittles to bingo to karaoke, and then also it's just magnificent food.
As you say, St. Helena is this dot in the middle of the Atlantic. Do you remember seeing it on the horizon for the first time?
In the morning we would approach the island. Some of us were from there 6, hoping to catch the first glimpse of this piece of land that we have been waiting for and traveling 6 days for. So yeah, you get the sunrise and then you get this cloud cover, and below it you see this massive land, and you're like, really, this is it? This is home for the next 4 years? Compared to the grand scale of the South Atlantic, 6 days of blue, it's incredible. And the closer you get, you're like, it just gets better.
Anina started work as the airport project's environmental officer. It was all ticking along, she was enjoying her work, and she loved the pace of island life.
How long had you been in the job for when some workers came to you and told you that they'd found some human remains?
I think it was probably about 8 months into the contract. We knew there was a chance of encountering human remains, but we didn't really expect it to happen.
Now, the reason Anina knew there was a chance is tied up in a little-known part of history. St. Helena's role in the transatlantic slave trade, where millions of Africans were forcibly enslaved and transported in horrific conditions to the Americas.
The human remains were a part of a mass burial ground of up to 10,000 formerly enslaved Africans. And this burial ground is located in Rupert's Valley. Rupert's Valley was the hub of the construction site. We had to build a 14-kilometer road, and that 14-kilometer road would pass through this known burial ground.
You say there's no burial ground, and you mentioned that huge figure, 10,000 formerly enslaved people buried. Did you know that existed? I mean, did you know that this is something that you might have come across?
Yeah, we knew about the burial grounds. So prior to the airport construction, a group of 2008 to excavate a portion of the burial ground that they believe would have been impacted by this construction, specifically the airport road. They removed 325 of those bodies.
Can you just explain to me why all of these people were buried there? I mean, what is the history of this place?
Yes, so St. Helena has served this very important role during the end of the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage. During 1840 and 1870, the British Navy was intercepting all the illegal Portuguese slave vessels that were still operating in the South Atlantic, going from Angola to Brazil. And on board these vessels, there would be hundreds of enslaved Africans and Indian children. So during the time that the British Navy intercepted these vessels, they needed a place to bring these people to shore to set them free or liberate them, as it was called. The Liberated African Establishment was founded in St. Helena, because St. Helena was just a perfect piece of land right in the middle of the South Atlantic, and just at the right location while all of this activity was still happening in the South Atlantic. So approximately 27,000 Africans were brought to St. Helena during that time. And because of the horrific conditions of the Middle Passage, approximately a third of them were either dead or dying on arrival in St. Helena. So that's where we get the number of close to 10,000 Africans that are buried on St. Helena Island.
After the discovery of the remains, Anina went to have a look at some of the personal possessions that were found buried with the bodies. There was one that stuck with her.
I was not expecting the braid when it was shown to me. I was expecting the beads, and I was expecting pieces of the coffins that were found within, but not this braid. And when I first saw it, I had to look again to see that it looked exactly like a braid that would have been on my hair or on a friend's hair, and how it would look so today, like it's from right now, from this present moment, and be tied to something that happened 300 years ago. Just absolutely knocked me. I think up until that point I had been sterilized by the numbers, 10,000, 27,000, 325. Here in front of me lay this braid that took me right back to my childhood and sitting between my mother's legs when she would braid my hair for school the next day. Even now still, I can directly relate to what hair means to a woman of color, and what it means to me right now personally, but also signifies this element of humanity tied to something that has been so dehumanized over centuries.
Anina couldn't let it go. What was found, what she saw, she wanted to do something. So she started a campaign to have the 325 bodies buried properly. What began as a part-time project soon became a decade-long mission. And in August 2022, Anina's hard work paid off. 14 years after the original discovery, an official reburial for the 325 people was held. To hear Emily's interview with Anina and my interview with Moira in full, head to the BBC Outlook website and click on episodes. For now, stay with us. The Outlook mixtape is back with 2 filmmakers just after the news.
This is the BBC World Service, investigating why South Africans are taking matters into their own hands when it comes to fighting crime.
Outside of a war zone, South Africa is one of the most dangerous countries in the world. Its murder rate is at a 20-year high.
It's out of control. There's no law in this place.
I'm Ayanda Chani, a journalist living and working in South Africa. I joined 2 volunteer units on patrol, a team of farmers near Pretoria.
The users will go out to the farms and cut the fences, steal anything of value.
By users, you mean drug users?
Drug users, yeah.
And a group in a township near Johannesburg.
What are you searching for?
smiles. We are ready to die for our community.
We see the risks they take, but who holds these patrols to account?
Crime and Punishment in South Africa at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries or wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Still to come on the Outlook Mixtape, the award-winning filmmaker with a passion for telling stories of people living on the edge. But what happens when the subject is his best friend's dangerous descent into drug addiction?
It was very difficult. It was upsetting, heartbreaking. You think, oh, slightly naive, maybe with two of us, you know. This the way to do this, really? At an older age, looking back, I can feel like my inner pain was caught up in that somehow also, you know.
That and more after the latest BBC World Service News.
BBC News with David Harper. President Zelensky says a shortage of recruits is damaging morale in Ukraine's armed forces. He also told the French news agency that his country needed better air defences to protect against Russian attacks. The Israeli army says its tanks, fighter jets and drones are engaged in confronting Hamas in the Jabalia area of northern Gaza. There's also been continued fighting in and around Rafah in the south of the territory. A Palestinian militant has been killed in an Israeli airstrike on the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank. The Palestinian Health Ministry said 8 other people have been injured. The head of the US Senate Judiciary Committee has called on a Supreme Court judge to withdraw from cases relating to the 2020 presidential election results. The demand comes after the publication of a picture of an inverted American flag flying outside the house of Justice Samuel Alito. 3 Spanish tourists and an Afghan citizen have been killed by gunmen in the city of Bamyan in central Afghanistan. Several other people, including foreign citizens, were wounded in the attack at a market. The Taliban said 4 people have been arrested. The presidents of Mexico and Guatemala have announced that they'll boost security and improve the infrastructure at 4 of their main border crossings. The measures are part of a wider program to address mass migration. LGBT activists have held a protest in Peru's capital Lima against a law that classifies transgender people as suffering from a mental disorder. The law is part of an update of insurable medical conditions. Croatia's parliament has approved a new government which sees the governing Conservatives forming a coalition with the far-right Nationalist Party. European parliamentary elections early next month are expected to mark a shift to the right. The US stock market index, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, has closed above 40,000 for the first time. The rise was propelled by easing inflation figures and strong economic growth. BBC News.
Welcome to the Outlook Mixtape. This is Side 2. I'm Aussie Fuchs. We're diving back into this week's most compelling stories from the Outlook team. Up next, 2 filmmakers who turn the lens on the lives of those closest to them. In the early 1990s, in Ohio, in the U.S., Collier Landry, who was only a boy at the time, found himself at the center of a deeply disturbing crime within the walls of his own family home. His mom, Noreen, had gone missing, and Collier was convinced his father, a respected doctor, was responsible. Those feelings took shape after a private conversation with his mom, not long before she disappeared.
In November of 1989, my mother had picked me up from school, and she took me to Bob Evans, which is like a little restaurant in the Midwest, and I loved oatmeal as a kid, so we were going to get some eggs and oatmeal. And my mom was driving in the car, and she said, "Collier, I want you to know something. I would never leave you. And if I ever do, and your father says I leave you, it's not because I left. It's because your father had me killed."
Wow. So she was scared? I mean, she thought he could kill her.
She was scared, yeah. And I said, "Mommy, that can't happen. That won't happen." And, you know, it comforted her, and then we sort of went about, you know, our life, right?
It's a very heavy load for an 11-year-old boy.
Yes, it is.
Collier didn't know it at the time, but his dad had just set up a new medical practice in Erie, Pennsylvania, a 3-hour drive away. He'd moved into the very lucrative field of occupational medicine. But Noreen, now finally filing for divorce, was starting to make life difficult for him.
One of the things that I started doing around that time is I started making a list and sort of preparations that if my mother and I had to leave, like when we pack a bag, we go to a certain place, if it felt unsafe, we could stay with my mom's friends. I made a list of all of my mother's friends' phone numbers, and I hid them in a stuffed Garfield that I had. It was a Santa Claus Garfield. It was in my room, so I collected Garfields when I was a kid.
The cartoon cat?
Yeah, the cartoon cat, yeah, exactly. And that ultimately played a major part in what happened next.
What happened next was that Collier's mother suddenly vanished. It was the day before New Year's Eve in 1989, and Collier saw her for the last time. They were home, together with his sister, waiting for his grandma to come around.
We were preparing because my grandmother was going to come that night, and we were making plans for, the new year. My mother, despite everything that was going on with my father, seemed to be a little more optimistic and was hoping for a fresh start in 1990 and a new life.
So that evening, what's the next thing you remember?
Later on that night, my grandmother shows up much later than I thought. My father just basically drops her off and leaves. My grandmother is there on the couch and we're talking, and I love my grandmother, and I go and I give my grandmother a kiss and a hug. And I say goodnight, Granny, and I give my mother a kiss and a hug, and I say I love you, Mommy, and I go to bed. And that was the last time I saw my mother.
Collier would go on to testify about Maureen's disappearance with extraordinary clarity. As he tells me what happened, the lines between that young boy and the Collier of the present blur a little. There's a sense of him on the stand, counting the details of a case he'd have to fight to bring to court when he was just a kid himself.
On the morning of December 31st, 1989, I awoke in the middle of the night to it sounded like a scream. And then I heard two very loud thuds that were about a minute apart. And between those thuds, I heard my father sort of muttering in a very low, I could recognize it was my father's voice.
Because he'd left earlier that evening.
Because he had left earlier that evening. So he was not in the house when I went to bed. And I'm in bed and I'm hearing this, and I'm trying to think to myself, okay, do I get up and go see what's going on? Or do I stay in bed? And I hear these footsteps walk slowly down the hallway, and I count them. And I'm laying in my bed and I'm staring at my Batman clock on the wall, which says 3:18 a.m. I'm just staying as still as I can under my covers, and I saw the feet out of my peripheral vision in the doorway, and I've got my head down, and everything inside me, there's like this, I don't know, call it spirit, call it what have you, is saying, don't look up. Don't look up. And I'm just pretending that I'm asleep, and then I see my mother. And I didn't. And somehow I went back to sleep. And I woke up a few hours later, the sun is out, and I run straight to my mother's bed. And I noticed that the sheets of the bed are all out of disarray, because my mother, when she would wake up, the first thing she would do is make her bed. And my little sister was in the bed, because she would, in the middle of the night, like, go from her room into my mom's bed at some point in the middle of the night. But I'm looking through the sheets and I'm looking for blood.
So, in the middle of the night, when you say there's like a spirit or something that keeps you from getting up, it's just like, Collier, just stay in bed, do not get up. What do you think would have happened to you had you moved, had you gotten up?
Oh, I mean, I don't think. I know that I wouldn't be sitting here today.
Right. What happens next? I mean, do you see your dad that morning?
Yeah, so I immediately go straight downstairs, and my father is sitting on the couch with a towel wrapped around his waist. He had just gotten out of the shower. And I said to him, I said, where is my mother? And my father very calmly looks up at me and goes, well, Collier, Mommy took a little vacation. And right then I knew that he had done something terrible.
Collier's father denied any wrongdoing, and the family carried on as if nothing had happened. But Collier was convinced otherwise. In secret, he began to contact his mom's friends, and finally made contact with a detective called David Messamore, who personally visited Collier at school.
And I say to him, Dave, when I go home, I'm going to pull the bookshelf out and look in the crawl space to see if I can find my mother's body. Then I'm going to look for my mother's purse. She was going to leave. She would have taken her purse with her. And I started just telling him, like, my plan is like little Detective Collier. And I said, I'm going to be observing my father's behavior like a hawk.
How did Dave Messamore react to what you were saying to him?
He told me this years later, but he just was looking at me like, I've never met a kid like this before. I've never met a kid that is so articulate and so on top of everything, and it has like a game plan, because most little kids, when they lose their mom, are losing their mind. They don't know what to do. They're crying. They're this, that, and the other. I'm 11 years old. I'm like, here's our action plan. That was my approach to this.
And he believes you.
And he believes me. And he's the only one.
David Messamore continues dropping by almost daily for the next 2 weeks, asking, without success, to speak to Collier's father, who refuses to talk with the police. And all this time, Collier is in constant communication with the detective, feeding him morsels of information to help with the investigation.
One of the nights he came home, my father had all these cuts on his hand. My father always had these really well-manicured hands. He had these scrapes and cuts on his hands that I noticed. I reported that to him. One of the other times, my father had gotten out of the shower and he asked me to rub Ben Gay on